Lots of us might not know this small detail, a detail that can make a big difference to your riding. We're going to find out all about Q factor and stance width and why we should give a stuff about it. When we're talking about bikes, Q factor is a measurement, and it's a measurement between the cranks, the outside section where your pedals thread in. The name is slightly odd, and I don't think it is related to ducks. It's more likely to be related to a physiological number called the Q angle, but more on that later. Q factor isn't stance width, but your Q factor will impact your stance width. What's stance width? Okay, this is effectively where your feet are placed, and on clipless pedals, well, they're going to be clipped into that place, and then on a flat pedal, well, there's still a margin of error, so it's where your feet are going to be placed. In this video, we're going to focus on Q factor and on stance width, and try and explain why it is important. As you can already probably tell, it is quite an interconnected puzzle. There's lots going on. Why could stance width and Q factor change our riding? Also, why would there be big differences on these very small changes for some riders and then not much at all for others? We can look at, well, both ends of this puzzle to try and find out why. Starting with the bike, it's symmetrical, and that is a big advantage. Okay, that Q factor and that stance width can change, but more often than not, it changes equally either side. Not always, but more on that later. Now, the other part of the puzzle is, yes, correct. That's me and that's you. And how we're made up and how we move can make a really big impact to if Q factor and stance width will make a difference to us. Whilst the bike is symmetrical, we're not symmetrical. Okay, it's very subtle, but lots of us have got asymmetries where we're not quite balanced. And as we're moving and walking around, well, you might not notice them, but if you try and attach that asymmetric thing to something that is very symmetrical and moves in very rigid ways, like a bike, you start to notice how things might not work. I touched on that Q factor is related to Q angle, but what is the Q angle? Right, I'm going to use my phone because I need to know the exact term, because this is a physio term. It's based in science, not just in bikes. Okay, the Q angle gets its name as it's the angle formed from the intersection of the quadriceps femoris muscle and the patella tendon, and this impacts the alignment of the knee joint in relation to the hip. As I said, it is all interconnected, so these small changes in how our body is in terms of skeletal changes or how flexible we are going to make big differences to how we fit and how we feel on a bike. Yes, we can add muscle and we can bulk up and get stronger, but we can't really do much about, well, the bones of us. We can't change that layout. Yeah, we can stretch lots and we can gain muscle, but we're kind of stuck with what we've got. And that means that we've got to try and adapt the bike to fit us better. And that's what Q factor and stance width is all about. So why do mountain bikes have different Q factors and different stance widths? Okay, not sure how that got there, but ever since Gary Fisher and those early Marin County pioneers put gears onto clunkers and made the modern mountain bikes, we've had a huge amount of revolution and evolution. And that's meant we've had lots and lots of different standards and different, well, non-standards. And one of the key ones that affect stance width, well, and Q factor is bottom bracket design. The bottom bracket width is directly going to change the Q factor and thus change your stance width. And there's lots of design considerations that engineers will have to manage. We're talking about tyre width, because if we want to put in a really big tyre, we might need a wider bottom bracket. We've got to think about suspension. We've got to think about frame design and frame material. There's lots of factors. Then we've got to think about the crank itself, because that's going to impact the Q factor and stance width as well. Different materials are going to be, well, thicker or thinner, and then they need to be shaped to clear those chainstays. And those chainstays are going to change in shape as well to fit different rear wheel standards. In just the brief few years that we've had 135, 142, now 148 and even 157. And that's the measurement of the rear axle or rear shoulder to shoulder of the back end of the bike. And that impacts on, well, how wide the cranks need to be to clear. It is a really complex design challenge. Whilst the industry has almost settled on a bottom bracket standard, There are lots of different ones. There's different iterations of threaded, and there's the myriad of different press fit ones. Thankfully, the industry has pretty much settled on a good range for Q factor, from around 168mm all the way up to around 174mm. But this is the mountain bike industry, so our standard isn't really standard, and there will be lots of outliers, so your bike could be different. Fat bikes, for example, their Q factor is way off. Downhill bikes, again, going to be very, very different. Why? Well, there's lots of different changes, but the key is that bottom bracket width. With all these different changes to rear wheel standards and bottom bracket widths, you might imagine that all of these things are going to affect how your chain lines up with your rear cassette, aka the chain line. And whilst there are differences in chain lines, effectively lots of brands are using offset chain rings. So they're spacing that chain ring in to make sure that it lines up with the cassette at the back of the bike. That in itself is a whole other video, but we're going to concentrate on Q factor and stance for now. There's one more factor that us mountain bikers do have to consider in this Q factor stance width conundrum, and that's what I like to dub the go Gnar or go far conundrum. Right, going far. You like cross-country rides that are really long, maybe cross-country racing, maybe cross-country marathon racing, the long stuff when you're on your bike for a long time. Here, it's actually quite simple, and that's that you need to optimise your Q factor and your stance width for your ergonomic output, because if you optimise it, well, you're going to get better performance out of your body to fit your bike. If you're not very interested in FTP or going long on your bike, FTP is functional threshold power, just if you didn't know, and you're more interested in getting rowdy and getting loose in technical terrain, then there is another piece of this puzzle that we have to consider, and that is our stance width, because actually widening out our stance position might give us more stability on the bike. What do I mean? Okay, here's an analogy. If you're a weightlifter and you're trying to squat a really heavy weight and you've got a really narrow stance and your feet are really impinged and pinched in, well, trying to lift that weight up high, it's really tricky. Widening your feet out can give you more stability. So if you're into more technical terrain and really crushing the Gnar and the heavy hits and the big jumps, then having a wider stance could help you and offer more stability. For trail riding, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because, well, we've got to decide which side of this wonderful conundrum we're going to sit. Are we going to optimise our ergonomics fully, or do we need to find some stability for that gnarly technical terrain? That is up to you to decide. A classic XC bike. It's a hardtail. We've got 110mm of travel up front, and well, it's perfect for those people that want to go really fast and really far, whether that's between the tapes for cross-country or XC marathon, or they just want to be a horizon hunter and head off the map and go really far. So with this bike, we've got a Q factor of 168. With these Egg Beater Crank Brothers pedals, I've got a 52mm stance. It's a design classic. Here's a great example of a modern trail bike. 150mm of travel up front, 140 in the rear. And it's one of these great bikes that you can take out on lots of different varied terrain. You can take it out on really tough adventures with lots of big drops and really gnarly terrain. But you could take it out on a bigger technical loop as well. And that's why you've got to balance the control and also the ergonomics. With this, the Q factor is 174mm. And I've chosen the Crank Brothers Mallet Trail pedals. And they have a stance of 57mm, so a little bit wider. And they should offer that balance between just pure ergonomics of the perfect Q factor and perfect stance with the better control of a little bit wider stance. And here's another example of an interesting trail bike. Yes, this is an EMTB, but it's important to mention EMTBs as well. This one is pedal assist, and it's a good example of an all-rounder. 160mm of travel up front, 150 in the back. It is really fun for burly terrain, but it can pedal too. And talking about pedaling, the Q factor on this is 177. So it is much wider, and that's not just down to stance, it's down to, well, having a motor in it. I've chosen to run the smaller Crank Brothers stamp pedal, and I've chosen the smaller one because I've got small feet, but also with this wider Q factor, the stance is also pushed out. So if I run the bigger pedals as well, it'd mean that, well, I might catch the odd trail bit of debris on the side of the trail. Ah, excellent. I feel we're all a little better illuminated to what Q factor is and what stance width is all about. But what can we do if we don't know what's right and we don't know what's wrong? For those that are pedaling really long for hours and hours, I don't think you can beat a really deep dive bike fit where a specialist can find out exactly how to optimize your ergonomic performance on a bike. Because you're asymmetric, even subtly, and that will make a big difference to how you fit onto the really symmetrical thing, a bike. Now you might think, I don't see loads of people fitting weirdly on bikes, but just as a case in point, the XC racer from Specialized, Hayley Batten, runs, well, an extra spacer on her right pedal. The only thing I can think of is that it is just to shimmy out one side of her body for a little asymmetry. It works for hers. She can win World Cups. Bike fit aside, what other things could be steering you or flagging that you need to look at Q factor and stance width? Well, think about if you've finished a really long bike ride. Did your knees hurt, or one knee in particular hurt more than the other? Did your hips ache? And maybe this is a better way of thinking about it. If you've got a road bike and you've done a similar length road ride and then you've done a similar length mountain bike ride, and it's on the mountain bike that you notice the differences, that could be a flag that there's something different about the Q factor that's causing some instability into your bike fit. I guess the other way to look at it as well is if you've ridden your e-bike for a similar amount of time and you've looked at your XC bike and it's on your XC bike that you're feeling some changes. Potentially you need a wider stance on your XC bike. Perhaps you notice that you're scuffing your cranks with your shoes, or that your heel is just tapping your chainstay under certain pedaling conditions. That could be a flag to Q factor. Perhaps you're struggling to find the right saddle for different bikes, and that might be Q factor related. Whereas there is lots of data to show that saddle width correlates to sit bone width, there isn't that correlation between your body dimensions and, well, how that Q factor and stance width affect. But if you're struggling to find the right saddle on one bike and it works on others, that could be a flag to look at Q factor and stance width. So you've decided that you do need to change your Q factor. Alas, this is where it gets really quite tricky, because actually beyond some cross-country cranks that are really high-end, there aren't a lot of ways to change your Q factor on a bike. You're kind of limited to what you've got. Stance width, however, then we've got room to play with. Here are the changes that you can do. As we've already mentioned, crank brothers have got 2 spindle lengths, and that means that you can change where the mechanism for their clip pedals is relative to the crank, and that means that you can effectively change not really the Q factor, but you can definitely change the stance width. Many brands do offer different spindle widths. So with Crank Brothers, we've got 52 and 57, so we've got 2 options there. With Shimano, we've got 51 and 55. With HT, for example, we've got 51.5 and 54.5, so we've got lots of little options. With clip-in pedals, we've also got lots of cleat adjustment too. Now, there are good tools out there to help you make this. Yes, you need to set them up for your personal ergonomics, but there is a little bit of shuffle room that we can do. Using this Ergon tool, we can show you really well how much adjustment there is. So you can slide the cleat all the way across, or all the way into the crank. Now, whichever system you use, you've just got to be mindful that how the system releases from the pedal, well, that can impact where this toe edge and this heel edge are going to interact with the crank. So if you run it really close in, well, in some conditions you might not be able to unclip. So just be mindful about that. But this whole wonderful stance width changes, it's not just related to clip-in pedals. No, there's fun to be had for those on flats as well. With flats, there's still room to play with stance width. And I would recommend looking at different sizes. Lots of different brands, whether it be Crank Brothers or others, offer their pedals in different sizes. Like, this is the small, it's pretty much 100mm by 100mm, whereas the large here, you can see it's a big chunk bigger, is about 112 by 114mm. And that means that you can play with stance widths, because it means you can, well, physically move your foot further out or shove it slightly closer to the crank. Obviously, you do need to be mindful that if you've got a smaller foot, then running the very big pedals means that you might have a little bit of overlap, and those bigger pedals, well, they might find a little bit more of that terrain if you're really shredding the Gnar. But it is another option to play with stance and with effective Q factor. Yes, Q factor and stance width are nerdy, but they can make a big difference. Small changes to how your biomechanical system, aka from your feet, through your ankles, through your knees, to your hips, can make a really big difference to how you enjoy your bike. And we're not like roadies. We don't just have to focus on that optimization of ergonomics. No, we can play around with stance width as well. So the other thing is that, yes, Q factor by itself is really difficult to change. But stance width, well, that's actually a really simple change. It can be as easy as switching out a spindle. That can be a really easy step to a better fitting bike. So if you've ever suffered from sore knees or sore hips after really long XC rides, I think it's well worth a deeper discussion trying to hunt down a really good bike fitter that can talk you through how some stance changes, maybe some wider pedals or some narrow pedals, can make a real difference to how you feel after a really big day. And again, it's really fun that we can actually play around with how the bike can feel and how much control we have as well. So if you're somebody that's heading out to the bike park or heading out to do lots of downhill runs, or even if you're a downhill racer or an enduro racer, playing around with stance width and making your stance wider and potentially more supportive can also help. And I think that's why this is actually nerdy, but really interesting, because the changes can be super simple. So, have you got nerdy with a bike fitter and optimised your ergonomic position on a bike? Or have you gotten a wider stance for hitting the bike park? Let me know in the comments down below.